Father and I were put in a barracks with 800 other men. 3 of us had to share one straw pallet. There wasn't room even to turn over. Quarantine had been a nightmare. We lay together all night on the cold floor, not an inch between bodies. At 4:30 a.m., they would beat us and kick us into the freezing cold of the field outside. There we would stand, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours, till every single person, not just in our barracks, but in the entire camp, was counted. If you fell or tripped, you were whipped or shot. They had to make sure that not one inmate would escape the fate planned for him by the Germans. Not one. No one was allowed inside during the day. The sun blazed down on us, and we were desperate for water, but there was none to drink. Only the midday soup, which was almost all water. We didn't even have our own bowls or spoons to eat with. 5 of us would have to share a bowl or soup, passing it from person to person, one sip for each, until it was finished. Conditions in the new barracks were a little better. We were given a ration of bread and margarine and a teaspoon of jam every few hours, but we had a brutal capo who beat and terrorized us at every opportunity. Father and I had to march 4 miles to work every morning, and when we marched, the band would play. Of course, you were not to look at anything as you marched, or you'd be beaten, but that first morning, something made me look up at the band, which sat slightly back from the road, and there she was, little Erica, playing a violin. She looked pale and almost like a skeleton, and I could see she was coughing. I could also see that she'd given up. Her eyes were hollow, empty. She thought we were dead. I knew it. Before I could think of what to do, we were past her. Father was marching behind me, and I dared not turn around to tell him. When we got to the factory at Monowitz, we were separated. I was put to work in a large rubber factory, dismantling equipment. Working in the place was like a nightmare. The factories and lodges seemed like heaven in comparison. Workers were beaten, whipped, or shot for not performing up to standard. SS men screamed, swore, shouted. It was chaotic and wild. And in the midst of all this, men in pressed brown business suits walked, stepping over dead bodies as if they were rags, checking with the foremen on progress and giving directions. Mostly Hungarian Jews made up my work squad. We couldn't understand each other, but it really didn't matter. My mind was on doing my work so I wouldn't get in trouble, and figuring out a way to see Erica. She hadn't noticed me, I was sure of that. I'd have to get her attention without attracting that of the guards. It was strange. Frankfurt, after the Nazis took over, had seemed like a nightmare compared to the way it had been before. And Lodz had seemed like a nightmare compared to Frankfurt, and now every minute in this hell, looking at the chimneys constantly belching smoke and fire, knowing that people like myself, children, mothers, were going up in flames, this was worse than anything I could imagine. Was there more? Could it get worse? I didn't think so. What could be worse than mass murder? But I was afraid that I had not yet hit bottom. I was afraid that the Nazis could prove to me that even this was not the worst. Only I could write Erica a note, I thought, but I had no paper, and if you were caught stealing the least thing, you would be shot. Then I had an idea. I went to the capo in charge of our unit and asked for a rag to oil down the machine I was working on. He found me one in a small vial of oil. When he wasn't looking, I bit into the cloth and ripped it in half. It was filthy and disgusting, and I had to spit many times to clean my mouth out. Then I dipped my finger into some black grease from the machine I was working on. I wrote on the cloth DNF alive. That's all I had room for. Then I had to figure out how to hide it. Our striped pajamas had no pockets after all. What would we own that would call for pockets? We had nothing. Still, my pants were held up on my string because they were too wide. I tucked the cloth into the string at my waist. The day dragged by. For lunch, we were served soup made out of nettles. How did they imagine we could continue to work for them with that kind of ration? But I suppose they didn't care. There were plenty more of us slaves, and when we got too weak, we'd be sent to the gas chambers and someone else would take our place. Finally, it was time to march back. I rejoined the group from our barracks and we marched 5 abreast. I managed to get myself on the end of the line, with Father beside me. Until I saw him, I hadn't realized how comfortable I'd been with him gone. He was everything to me now, and I didn't like to be separated from him for a minute. Father, I said as we marched. Father, I saw Erica. He almost stopped. He stumbled. I grabbed him and he kept moving so our SS guard wouldn't notice. Are you sure? She was playing in the band as we marched out. She doesn't look good, but she's alive. I've written her a note. I'm going to try to get it to her as we march by. They kill you here for less than that, Daniel. Be careful. I will. We marched on in silence. Still, how could I get it to her without the SS guards